So give me a little update, like a little background of, you know, how you got here.
So for years, I thought that I got here accidentally, and it certainly presented it that way to me as a younger guy. I was in my 20s. I was living and working in Manhattan,
Hmm.
and I was working. I went to social work school at Columbia, and I had done a job working with the disabled for a couple of years out of grad school, and
Hmm.
I was just kind of wanting something different, and it seemed like this kind of fell into my lap through a contact that my sister had, and so I go on this job interview at this therapeutic community,
Yeah.
not knowing anything really
Uh-huh.
professionally about treatment,
Uh-huh.
and so I accept the job again, still largely green, and I was just, I mean, I was hooked. I mean, the just right from jump, Mark. I mean, I think the intensity of active addiction, listening to the stories, listening to how destructive it is, and then being able to see the incredible transformation that an individual and their family undergoes in real sobriety, real recovery, was so fundamentally moving. It was unlike anything I had ever seen.
Hmm.
The intensity of working with those men, it was an all male facility, were just,
So that
um,
wasn't Alina Lodge. That was another
uh,
facility.
yeah,
Okay. Okay.
this was a therapeutic community, 60-bed therapeutic community at TC in Manhattan.
Okay.
And so much of what I had learned academically in grad school and in undergrad in psychology really didn't apply. I remember
Mhm.
going back to my office and thinking, like, even though I just graduated from Columbia a couple of years earlier, like, I really don't know anything. I mean,
Right.
particularly because I hadn't been in active addiction myself.
Right.
So I didn't know the language. I didn't know what it looked like. I didn't know anything about recovery. Again, from a professional perspective, I'll share some of the personal stuff with my family in a second. But
Hmm.
so that was my foray into the field, and I was literally the first week. I remember sitting in my office going, "I do not know what I'm doing. I need so much help,
Yeah.
but I think, this is what I'm supposed to be doing." And so it really felt like I fell into it. I think years later now, as I've learned more about the 12 steps in the spiritual part of the program, I really think it was my higher power, and it was really it's become a vocation, a love for helping men and now women and their families in their journey to be sober. But at the time, it just felt like I fell into it, um, with no intention.
And that's interesting because, we really do have our own culture, our own subculture in recovery. We have our own language, our own nomenclature. We have, things we do and ways we communicate that people on the outside world, in the outside world may not get, or they may find even strange, or, we kind of, so here you're an outsider coming into this world.
I was an outsider in every way possible with that particular group of men, because it was men that were predominantly of men of color. It was a
Mm-hmm.
lower socioeconomic clientele, so it was largely public assistance. It was not private pay, and so I was not coming from a position of having my own addiction and then sobriety. I was coming in as a white man into a
Mm-hmm.
group of men that was largely Hispanic and Black. I
Mm-hmm.
was coming in with substantially more formal education than those guys. And so, really, every marker that you could think of that could separate
Right.
was there,
Right. Right.
um, except basketball. And so, and I'm not kidding. Basketball early on became the way that I could connect with the guys, because
Yeah.
there was not one guy in that facility that could beat me on the basketball court. And so, even though within the clinical treatment room I got no credibility,
Right.
on the basketball court I did, and that
Yeah.
respect actually transitioned into the treatment room. And I was pretty open. I mean, when I don't know something, I'm not going to pretend it. I asked a lot of questions. They knew they were getting the green young man that didn't know anything. But I also learned very quickly that I was going to challenge people in their thinking and in the behavior, and you weren't going to play me and you weren't going to get over it. And so I think between basketball and that kind of approach really led to some really strong therapeutic alliances and relationships, and then some of the work that I was able to help the guys undergo. So that's my professional life and story. But I also had addiction in my family. And so I'm the sibling of someone that went to treatment and had a lot of years of sobriety. So I didn't witness it much because I was the oldest in my family. I have 2 younger sisters. So I didn't witness a lot of it firsthand. But my family, my sister went to treatment. And so I did get that perspective from seeing a loved one struggle and then a loved one be in recovery. So I was a bit more removed because I was older at that point, but addiction certainly runs in my family, and drinking and drugging, throughout the generations. And some people are in recovery and some not.
So how old were you when your sister went to treatment?
I think she was 18, and so I would have been 23. So you're at home, and I'm already living in New York.
Right. So you're kind of not part of that nuclear family anymore.
Correct. Yeah. Not really launched. I'm living in New York by, alone as a single kind of guy, just finishing grad school and kind of figuring out my life. And so I was really removed from the day-to-day of it, both active addiction and then even recovery. I didn't, I know there's a lot of phone calls, and talking to my mom years ago, there was a lot of phone calls with a lot of fear. About whether my sister was going to get sober or not.
And she did.
She did, yeah.
And she's still sober today.
She's no, I would not say that. According to my definition of sobriety, I think within our field we see that even what does that mean to be sober can really be different. So she's a social drinker, I think very minimally, but that's kind of where she's at now.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, the idea of harm reduction does come up more often now than I've seen in the past. But she's doing well overall.
Yes. Her life is manageable, and I think it's a very infrequent thing for her. So listen, for most people, that's not very successful. When they
not at all. No. And I think we should put it out there that, for most people, and including myself, I know that if I, picked up, and I'm in a lot of different programs. I think I'm in every program there is, except for Mistresses of Married Men. That's the only one I'm not, anonymous. That's the one I'm not in. But yeah, I mean, I always think like if, I would be good for like 24 hours and then it would be a disaster.
Yeah. And that's most people that have substance use disorder. That's their truth. That's their reality.
So don't try that at home.
No, and so I come from a place of believing in abstinence and believing that for most of our men and women, and you're sharing your experience as well. The first drink or drug, the first attempt at casual use is just it's a disaster, and it gets worse than it did the time before, and it's all the things that sobriety can build up, you lose very, very quickly for most people. So.
Yeah, I've never heard anyone in a meeting come back after a relapse and say, it was pretty good this time. It wasn't bad. I, stuck to one drink a night, or, people, the stories they come back. First of all, they say they stop going to meetings.
Correct.
Is like, the standard across the board, and that's what triggers the relapse. But they always come back to say that, like I just came from the front lines and it is really, really bad.
Yeah. I just lectured on last Monday to our community. I was talking about seemingly irrelevant decisions, SIDS, not the sudden death syndrome, but a different kind of SIDS. And that relapse that is, you're talking about not going to meetings. That's probably the most frequent one that you hear about, right? Is, hey, I stopped going to meetings, I stopped connecting with my sponsor, my group, et cetera. But we really talked to our men and women. We were having this discussion last week about that is certainly almost always in that kind of progression towards picking up the substance. But before that, a lot of our work is before that. Some of the character defects that begin to present themselves, and some of that distorted thinking, and some of the things that move people off a spiritual path. And so those really subtle things that when you point them out, it's hard to see its connection to relapse, right? Once you start hanging out with people that are using, you're not going to meetings, you're doing all those things, it's easy to be like, well, of course you picked up, right? Because you can see it, it's easy, the connection's there. It's that earlier stuff that is really hard to see, but if you can do something at that time and really get in front of it, you have a more likely chance to put yourself back on the path that you need to be on to continue your sobriety. And so it's those subtle things that really happen for people, before they start, before even the behaviors start kind of presenting themselves. And so, we want our men and women and people in recovery to be very, very vigilant about those parts of self that can get in the way, or, the things that they are externally triggered by, but also what happens internally when those things kind of present themselves, because it's the internal piece that really can be really, really damaging, the response, right? So for example, right, someone that has particular sensitivity to a family dynamic, right, can be easily triggered by that type of dynamic. And then, they might have a resentment behind it. I did see, one of your podcasts was talking about resentment, which is, really, really dangerous for people to sit on a resentment in recovery. And so, what happens when mom, dad, spouse, kid says something, and it triggers that internal piece of inadequacy or feeling shame or whatever is going on internally. To be aware of that, the thoughts and feelings and the body sensations, are really, really important. So a lot of work goes into that in helping our men and women here at Alina, be able to stay sober.
Yeah. And if you go out, I mean, you may never come back.
Yeah.
You never make it back. So,
and there's a lot that don't. There's a lot that don't. Tragically.
Right. No, that is true. So what point did you jump from this first program did you come over to Alina Lodge?
So I worked in New York for 3 years as a line social worker, and then I had the opportunity to become the director of the sister program, which was a 100-bed co-ed facility in Manhattan. So I ran that facility for 7 years. And then my wife and I had moved to New Jersey at that point. We were trying to start a family, and just the commuting and just the intensity of being a director, in that facility was just too much. And so I moved for a very short time, doing some outpatient stuff. I did not like it. I really loved the work that you can do in longer term care and residential care. And so then I moved back in, and again, it seemed like one of those conversations where I wasn't looking to come to Alina Lodge. I was talking to a former colleague of mine, and I was talking about, the paperwork and some of the expectations at that place I was working at. And he said to me, Bill, so much of our time is spent on student care. We call our clients, our patients, students here because they're here to learn how to be sober. And so I literally breathed out loud. I said, I would love to work at a place where the care of the men and women and the families is paramount, that's first. And he said, well, we just had a guy resign last week. I had my resume by the end of the day, probably, and I had an interview that week with the former executive director. And so that was 2012, and I came on board then. And again, very similar, experience. I came in as a line worker, and I did that for 6 years, and then I had the opportunity. My predecessor, Michael Hornstein, who had been the executive director for 10 years and connected to the lodge for 30 plus years, had announced his retirement, and I applied for the executive director position. So it's been now just about 2 years that I've been in my current position.
That's great. And so, I mean, and the lodge is very different from most or all treatment centers. A lot of treatment centers have gone from that 28, 30-day model to a lot of them are now offering 60, 90 days. But you guys are way different than that.
Yeah, so we've been around since 1957. We have always looked at time as being a key ingredient to people becoming, sober and in recovery. And so, literally from our inception, where other people were literally having like dry out weekends, our founder was doing 6 weeks, and then 10 weeks, and then 12 weeks, and longer and longer. And so we have found that with time, especially those early couple of months where someone's brain is so drastically impacted by chronic use, that the ability to work through some of the pause, right, post-acute withdrawal symptoms, the memory impairment, the emotional lability, the obsessions and cravings to use, right? All those things, the impact in gait, the impact in stress response, all those things that make early recovery so difficult. Right? We had a dopamine crash when you take someone off their drink or drug. They're looking at all the destruction, that their active addiction was in, and now we expect as an industry to give them 28 days, and that they're ready to be sober on the outside, even with ongoing work, even with extended care. We think that's a losing formula for many. Yeah. Again, for some that works. But we think keeping people in primary care longer allows for really significant brain healing. And then we get to that some of that underlying stuff that you just can't get to in a shorter place. And I think so that has been the way that we have approached working with men and women and their families for a long period of time. Now, recently, over the last 6 months, we've actually added a 90-day component, but it's still unlike other places. So we're not doing extended care. We're still evaluating people on the way in. And then if they are clinically appropriate, then we're doing 90 days of primary care. And the reason for that is that we feel like we can offer more help to more men and women. So for so many people that got to our doors, it was after being emotionally and financially exhausted from going to other places. And we believe we give a really, really good clinical offering to our men and women. And it was like, why do we have to wait till people either don't get to us because the progression leads to death that much more quickly, or they're exhausted. They've gone to so many other places. And so we said, well, we want to help men and women earlier in their progression. So we still are going to be here for the chronic relapse of the person that has gone to treatment again and again and just needs the longer term approach, which is more like 9 months for us. But we also wanted to have an offering where we can bring men and women in and offer them 90 days for those that are less severe in their progression. And we think we can help more men and women and their families that way. And so we're doing both. And a lot of the tenets of the program have not changed, though. We still heavily believe in family education. We believe in telling our students the truth of what they need to change so that they have a better chance of recovery. And so unlike other places that are really marketing amenities, we don't market amenities. We understand, we believe that you have a disease, a very serious disease that if left untreated can lead and will lead to death. And we believe in telling people what they need to do to move away from that. As opposed to come to us because we have a 5-star chef or we have thread count that is better than anyone else, or that we have the best gym you've ever seen, or that blah 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 blah, or that we have golf, or we have all these other amenities. We believe in really working with the individual and bringing to their attention things that they need to change. Now, it's done with care and compassion, in individual and group work. And of course, we have a lot of things that other programs have. So we have specialty group, sex and relationship group, grief group. We've done a ton of family work. We're excited about, the potential maybe of having COVID in the spring really kind of being behind us so we can get families more here on campus and stay with us. We've incorporated EMDR so that we can get to some of the underlying traumas. We've incorporated mindfulness-based relapse prevention. We are building a community integration piece so that we can bring people off our campus. So we're infusing some of the things that we've classically done, but some of the core stuff of telling people what they need to change. really is still a core piece of us. We don't want people to leave here and not know what are the obstacles that they need to change within themselves. You know, what
Right.
resentments do they need to let go? Where do they need to work on acceptance and moving away from anger? What trauma have they not addressed that really needs to be worked on, and there needs to be some resolution to, so that they're not going to be walking out of treatment, you know, a trigger away from responding in a very unhealthy way. So we think that we're trying to help more men and women. We love the core of what we've always done here since 1957. And we believe now, with, you know, being able to stay and be available to our long-term families and do a 90-day program, that we're going to be able to help more families, more men and women, you know, attain and maintain lives of recovery. So we're really excited about it.
I think that's good, you know, because I think that, you know, I do believe in the Alina Lodge system. It makes all the sense in the world to me that it could take somebody multiple months to finally surrender and finally, drop the pose and start to recover. And I meet a lot of families that they have been through 5 or 6 treatment centers. But I can also see how on somebody being presented with this option saying, wow, 9 months or a year is a really long time,
Right.
but I can do the 90 days. And I always tell people, I think once you get to treatment, once you see where it, what it is, because in their mind they think it's something different. Once you see what it is, you say, oh, this I can do this,
Right.
I can stay here.
And our very first 90-day person actually ended up transitioning into our longer term program because they were feeling so good about themselves and the work that they had done, and they had gotten out of that first couple of months, which is so difficult, that she said, listen, I want to stay longer. I want to do more clinical work. And so, we certainly get a lot of resistance on the clinical side when you're dealing with men and women that are coming in for your longer term program. We're getting less resistance on the 90-day. And now
I think it's a smart move. Yeah, I think it's a very smart move.
And now we just need to educate more and more people that, hey, listen, there's all the classic, really wonderful things that Alina Lodge provides, and now we're doing it for 90-day people. And again, it's clinically appropriate. So we're using DSM and we're using ASAM criteria to really differentiate. So if someone wants to come in and they're saying, no, I'm only doing 90 days, and the severity is so severe that we really don't think that we could help them, then we would be ethically driven and say, listen, we don't think that you're appropriate for our 90-day. And so it really is going to be assessed on the front end, with our admissions team, and with the referents like yourself, interventionists and other referents, to be able to say, hey, listen, let's do an assessment and make sure that they're in the right track. We just think 90 days for people is so much better than 28 days.
Absolutely.
And we're hopeful that, as we build this, that we're going to be able to really demonstrate the efficacy. We're doing some cool stuff in another 2 weeks here. We partnered with this group called Omni. It's a nonprofit research group based out of Colorado. They did a retroactive study on our alums, so they're going to be presenting us with the data at the middle of December. And we're going to be able to look at the efficacy of our program. We're doing some stuff with NATAB moving forward and looking at some of the principles of the 12 steps and things like gratitude and acceptance and moving past resentments and developing patience and tolerance and all those things that we talk about, conversations that you and I have had.
Sure.
We want to look at the efficacy of those types of things, in addition to, have you picked up or not picked up? Do you have a job or don't you have a job? Have you been arrested or haven't you been arrested? We think there are greater markers for real recovery that go beyond just some of those basic things, because we want people to fundamentally be able to experience something very different in their recovery and their sobriety and their families. And we think that some of those markers are really there to be looked at, and data behind them to say, hey, listen, it's more reason why we think Alina Lodge is the program for you.
Right. So what are you seeing right now in terms of people coming in? Like, are you seeing, more men, more women? What ages? What's does that vary from time to time? Has COVID changed that?
COVID hasn't,
What's
yeah, COVID hasn't changed the demographics too much. We traditionally see more men than women, and I think that's probably true for
across the
most.
board? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, right. Because
I would say.
there's a lot of obstacles. We're still in a culture where females are still largely, driving families and kind of family head of household with kids. And so I think treatment for many females is a bit more of an obstacle. And so that impacts, I think, the admission side of things to all treatment programs. So we're still seeing more men than women. We have a variety. I mean, probably our average age currently on campus is probably in the 30s, and so we have those individuals that are in their 20s and earlier on in how many treatment programs they've attended. But typically, those people, the progression of their disease has been that much more rapid, right? So when you get the alcoholic, historically, that progression is much slower. When you have people that are using heroin, crystal meth, and benzos and things like that, and other opiates, the progression is that much more fast and rapid. And so, but probably the average age is probably in its 30s. We have a bunch of people in their 40s, a bunch of people in their 50s, and we have one or two in their 60s as well.
Wow. So yeah, there are fewer and fewer garden variety drunks nowadays.
Correct. It's
So
definitely a complicated picture.
yeah. So my wife and I went to the movies yesterday. And by the way, we were the only ones in the theater. We go to it's called the Living Room Theater. It's at the Florida Atlantic University campus. And so it's kind of like an arts theater. And we saw a movie that I think is actually on Amazon, but they're showing it in the theater. It's called The Sound of Metal. And it's about a guy who's a drummer in a heavy metal band and suddenly loses his hearing. And he's also a recovering addict. And he's right away goes back to smoking, and this life change is obviously very triggering. Right. And he gets taken to this program where it's a deaf community. It's a deaf therapeutic community. And I couldn't help. It really reminded me of Alina Lodge so much, and I think it's worth watching. And what was interesting to me is the guy who runs the community. Turns out everybody there is basically in recovery, but they're also deaf. And the guy that runs the community says to this guy who's really lost all his hearing suddenly. He's had this injury. And he says to him, he says, you're not here to fix this. You're here to fix this. And I don't know if I just lost you for a second, but I thought it was interesting. I thought it spoke to the kind of, the therapeutic community that you have. It's, we're not going into to just fix someone's addiction per se. You're fixing everything.
Right. So, because the disease of addiction impacts mind, body, spirit. And so we really want to be able to address all three of those. And so it's really addressing self in all those ways. And so whether it's medical and psychiatry and nutrition and all those types of things, and working out and getting sleep and all those kind of traditional things, or it's, listen, there's a lot of pain. Nobody on this campus is here without a ton of pain that they've been running away from and trying to escape through a variety of things. And so you have to get to that pain. You have to allow people to heal from that pain. There's a ton of fear. So those things, that emotional response in the ways that plays out is very, very significant. And so it's not just about one piece. It's not just about the substance. It's really about self, and when you can move someone away from that, you really give them a great chance of being sober. And so it's the frustrating part, I think, about the industry. They collectively, we dumb it down to just being about alcohol or
right,
drugs.
and it's not.
It's not.
So that's just a symptom.
Yeah. And so
it's a symptom.
Yeah. So it's a symptom of so many other things that need to be addressed. And so we do that in a very wholesome way to really address mind, body, spirit.
Yeah, no, very interesting. So in what, one of the things I'm seeing, and I want, so I spent Thanksgiving doing an intervention, and one of the things I've come across with young people, I seem to go through waves where I get calls for older people, then it's all younger people. It just seems to go that way. And lately it's been adolescents. And it's amazing to me that adolescents, how they've changed. How much more, he's a young guy, but he's going to be 18 in a couple of months. So, he's nearing becoming an adult, in that their stubbornness. I've had this a few times, and where I try to explore it, then they just say, no, I'm not going. And they're not used to getting consequences. They have a relationship with their families where they are the boss.
Right.
They think they're running the show. But for me as an intervention, it's very difficult because I try to explore. So I understand the fear. I get the, why you don't want to do this. And I try to unwrap that a little bit. Tell me what's behind that. And they can, or they don't. And they just say, just no, and that's
I think the language is not there, right? Especially when you're talking about an 18-year-old. You're talking about someone that has been arrested and regressed in their development. And so the language isn't there. I think you're also speaking about the dynamically what happens in families where there's an addiction is that, often the kind of identified individual that has the addiction becomes so powerful. The addiction, the disease becomes very powerful in the family. And so there's also a lot of fear and pain for other family members. And so our founder, Mrs. Delaney, said, if I only could get 5 minutes with either the addict alcoholic or the family, I'd take the family every time, because the real work has to be in the family, that the family's got to be willing to make a different decision. Because if you think about it, the person that's in active addiction has impaired cognitive functioning. The prefrontal cortex is literally impaired, and that impairment lasts well beyond after they stop drinking or drugging. So you're asking someone with an impaired brain to make a healthy decision. That can't happen. And so there's been a lot of Ward Blanchard, who runs the Blanchard Institute out of North Carolina, spoke for us last spring, our spring conference. There's been more information and scanning in the brain of family members. And what we're finding, I think Texas Tech, check it out, Texas Tech, I think, did some of the brain imaging, that the brains of the family members were responding as if they were in active addiction in the same way the individual were. So we have families that have impacted brains too, even though they're not actually using the substance. And so you have a unit that is really, really stuck. And so it often takes the impetus of the family to really make somebody go to treatment. And that's a hard place to put the family because of all these things that we're talking about. And so when you can get the family moving in that direction, then you have a more likely chance that the individual can then, lead to sobriety.
Yeah, and I always tell families, 80% of my work is with the family. I really don't meet the identified individual until the day of the intervention. And while my involvement with them is very meaningful, because often we're getting on a plane together, we're traveling, and by somewhere, a couple hours into that, I do have a good connection with them. Most of my time is spent with the family, preparing with the family, and we do a full day of pre-intervention. When the families
moves the family, you're educating, and then you're moving the family towards making a healthier decision, which is difficult. The other thing that I would reflect in what you're saying, Mark, is, we talk about powerlessness, right? Step one talks about powerlessness over, and unmanageability. But remember, these individuals, and I know you know this, but our families don't. These individuals are experiencing powerlessness in everything, certainly the drink or the drug, but there's so much powerlessness that goes with active addiction. And so for an 18-year-old to say no to you, I'm not going, it is some of the only ways that they can have power is with their voice or their behavior. So when they come into treatment, we see a lot of that resistance, and they will push back, and they'll use their voice, and they'll say, no, I'm not doing it, and I don't want to do it, and the kind of you can't make me thing, partially because it's the only avenue that the powerless have is to
Right.
have a voice sometimes. And so when you can put it in context, it sometimes is helpful. And so, these individuals can be difficult to work with, and in their family of origin can be very, very difficult. It's the powerless trying to demonstrate power, and it doesn't work.
Yeah. No, and I think that's what it is. And there is that desperate attempt.
Yeah.
And a lot of these kids, I really like these kids. And I often tell them, if you knew what I know, you'd be getting on that plane right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
But their perspective is so impacted by their chronic use. They literally can't see it, believe it, hear it. And so then we're asking their family to step in and make a healthier choice for their loved one, much like a therapist or a sponsor does, right? In early recovery, or even in early treatment, if someone's going to see a therapist, you're going to someone to help make healthier decisions because you can. And so that's what a sponsor does. I don't know how to manage my life. I don't know what this sobriety is about. Show me what I should be doing. So you're relying on a healthier brain to help you make decisions. And so it's no different in where you're at in the continuum. You're working with families and saying your loved one is so impaired that you have to make the decision for them. Ultimately, they get to decide, but then there's going to have to be some consequences, because otherwise the individual won't seek out treatment on their own.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. So I don't want this to go on too long because nobody will watch it.
Although I want you talking to, because I have such passion for it. I mean, you said
yeah.
Once you remove the drink or the drug, I mean, the men and women that we get to work with are beautiful, beautiful men and women and their families, but they're in pain and they're hurt and they don't know and they need help. And there's nothing better than helping, just being, somewhere in their process, stepping in and walking with them during their journey. I just don't find anything better. It's the most rewarding thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, and seeing and getting calls from treatment centers and hearing that people are doing really well and they're identifying their trauma and they're opening up. I went to a 28-day program, but it still then took me a decade to figure out, to understand, or longer, to understand the trauma that was driving it. And it took me working with other people in this capacity for me to see, I joke sometimes, say, I don't know if I've helped anybody else, but I feel like I've really gotten, much better in the time I've been working in the field. But yeah, and I'm glad to know about the 90-day thing, because I think that's a game changer for you guys. And I just didn't know about that. One of the people that I'd interviewed is Jerry Moe from the Betty Ford Center, who, I don't know if you know him, but he runs the children's program. And it's interesting to me because of what they're doing, how they're intervening on young children who often blame themselves for their parents' addictions. Right. And it seems like a no-brainer to me that this is something that should be done more frequently at other treatment centers, intervening on children and helping them to avoid that path. Because it almost sometimes, for the trauma of living with an alcoholic or an addict is very significant.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that active addiction for family members has lasting impacts. It is a traumatic experience. And for many of our men and women, because they've been into treatment and might have some time of being sober men and women, and then to go back out in that kind of cycle can also then be very traumatic, because there's hope in sobriety and recovery, and then to have that someone go back to using, and then the hope of sobriety. But that kind of cycle becomes really, really impactful for kids. And so it's like we really like working with families that are really getting, in addition to the help and education that we're offering, but for families to also get additional help for themselves is really, really important.
Yeah.
Really important.
Well, thanks for doing this. And, I know I could talk to you for a lot longer.
I could. One day we'll see each other.
Yeah, no, that would be great. Well, when things clear up, I'd love to come up there and visit. And I love being on that campus. I love, how spiritual it is. And
it's so tranquil. It is so peaceful. I love coming to work to work with our men and women and my colleagues. The drive-in and the tranquility of the campus certainly is a nice addition. It's
a great place.
Yeah,
it's a great place. And I'm going to put your contact information and the website and stuff for Alina Lodge in the comment section of the YouTube video. So
that'd be great. Yeah, if anyone has any other questions, wants to reach out, be more than happy to have conversation and maybe be of help to some other men and women and their families.
That'd be great. Well, thank you, and happy holidays.
Appreciate it, Mark. You as well. Talk to you soon.
Take care. Thanks a lot, Bill.
Bye.
Bye-bye.